Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to American history for the second to last time this year. We are almost done, and pretty soon you'll be able to enjoy a fun summer of, I don't know, possibly not getting to do anything, but maybe. So it looks like we're maybe starting to be able to do a few things. So, hopefully you'll be able to have some fun over summer vacation. But who knows? Who knows where it goes? But nonetheless, we are almost at the finish line here. And we are now getting to the parts of history class that I actually remember firsthand, which is, kind of fun and then sort of not because it sort of makes me feel old. Nonetheless, here we are. So when we last left our villains, as the case may be, Bill Clinton was getting himself impeached and nearly thrown out of the White House, but he doesn't get convicted in the Senate, so he hangs around. And it's a weird situation going into the 2000 election because on one hand, the whole impeachment thing didn't fly really well in the polls as far as working to the advantage of the Republicans, but it also wasn't a good look for the Democrats either. So the economy was in a good place, which typically favors the incumbent party. But it's also true that it's really hard for the same party to hold office 12 years in a row. It doesn't happen all that often. It hadn't happened in our history since Bush was able to follow up Reagan's 2 terms in '88. So the Republican nomination winds up being contested between the governor of Texas, George W. Bush, who was the son of the former President George Bush, now generally referred to as George H.W. Bush. And so he was aiming to be the first son of a president to become president since John Quincy Adams, like way back in the day. So he was, was actually an interesting figure. He had actually been the owner of the Texas Rangers Major League Baseball team. He had made some money in oil, in business. And then he kind of tried his hand at the family business of politics, had become the governor of Texas, did a very good job as the governor of Texas, was very popular, was noted for his ability to kind of work across party lines in Texas, although didn't work out as well as he wanted it to in Washington because the Democrats in Washington are a little different than the Democrats in Austin. But he had, and he ran on a platform that he called compassionate conservatism, which was, he was not like a die-hard economic conservative hardliner. He actually, part of his platform involved, some major education programs and some major expansion of Medicare as it relates to prescription drug benefits that a lot of conservatives thought was too big government. But he struck a chord really strongly with especially religious social conservatives. He did a really good job of talking about life issues and things of that nature. And he had, even though his family had come from Massachusetts, he and was one of the wealthy families of the country. He nonetheless had really lived in Texas a long time, owned his own ranch, and had really Texas really got in his blood. And I mean, he's definitely comes off as a true Texan despite his family's kind of East Coast rich kid roots. And so that kind of played well with a lot of the voters. His challenger in the Republican primary was John McCain, who was probably the most famous moderate Republican of the era. McCain was a bona fide war hero. He had been, his father had been one of the chief admirals during the Vietnam War. McCain became a fighter pilot. He got captured by the enemy, was put in the infamous Hanoi Hilton that we talked about, and was given multiple opportunities to exit on account of his father's status, and he refused to leave if they wouldn't release his, the other people in his unit with him. And so he literally endured, 2+ years of torture at the Viet Cong when he had the ability to escape if he so chose. So, but he wound up, though, developing kind of the word that they always like to use was maverick. voting record where a lot of times, where he a lot of times was a little more liberal than most Republicans were, and in fact was courted as a Democratic nominee for vice president in 2004. But Bush and McCain had a pretty spirited primary, but Bush winds up winning. And then on the other side, the Democrats go with Al Gore, who had been Bill Clinton's vice president after having been a senator from Tennessee for a long time. Al Gore was, at one point in time, was a very moderate Democrat. At one point, he had been pro-life and pro-gun rights, and then once he decided to launch a career at the national level and start courting the White House, he moved very far to the left of his original positions, flip-flopped on abortion, flip-flopped on guns, and kind of became kind of a more straight-ticket liberal. And in particular, he made environmentalism kind of his famous cause. He cared a lot about the whole environment thing, and in fact, helped produce a really famous documentary about global warming that is largely proven to have been a severe exaggeration. He was going around in the year 2000 saying that the world was going to explode by, 2014 or 15 if we didn't do anything, and we're still here. So, anyway, Bush and Gore wind up being the race. And it comes down to being one of the closest presidential elections in American history. I'd say if you were to say what's the first thing we've talked about this year that I actually remember living through, it actually was probably the impeachment. Although, your parents would try to shield you from the most sordid details of the impeachment story, but I knew it was going down. But this is one that I really vividly remember. I would have been 12 or 13, so I would have been, I guess, in middle school at the time, and I remember we were homeschooling, so we would wind up as we get into this disputed election, just like every day, like we would pause and watch the news for like an hour every morning, and Mom would call it class. So I guess it was what we were learning. We also got all of our regular classes done by 12 o'clock, so it's okay. Anyway, you have the situation where it's a really, really, really close race, and come election day, we have one of the closest elections in history. Al Gore winds up winning the popular vote, meaning the nationwide tally of ballots cast for him across the country, by about 300,000 votes nationwide, which, here's some perspective. So I looked this up. There's a little over 3,000 counties in the United States. So on average, if you averaged all the counties in America out, how it would break down, Gore won by an average of 10 votes per county. So every county in America, it was a 10-vote election. That is unbelievably close. That's about as close as you can get. The final percentage total was like 49.4% to 49.0%, with a few percentage points being given to a relatively strong third-party candidate named Ralph Nader, ran on the Green Party ticket. So it all comes down to the way the Electoral College shakes out. It all comes down to the state of Florida. Literally, whoever wins the state of Florida becomes the president of the United States. That's how close it is. Bush is ultimately going to win Florida and do so by, and finish winning the Electoral College by 5 votes. Had Bush lost, Gore would have won by, about 30 or so. So Florida, unfortunately, though, turns into a madhouse. And in particular, one thing that happens, Bush's vote totals are driven down a little bit by the fact that the news media, and what turns out to be a very controversial decision, calls Florida for Al Gore based on exit polls before the polls closed in the Central Time Zone. Florida is split between East Coast and West Coast, not West Coast, between Eastern Standard and Central Standard Time. So parts of Florida are on Central. The parts of Florida that are on Central tend to be more Republican than the ones that are on Eastern. They erroneously called Florida too soon, which inspired lots of people not to go vote. In addition to that, which has forever changed the way they report these things now. In addition to that, Miami, which was Miami-Dade County and nearby Broward County were considered Democratic strongholds. This was the last election before most states went to computerized voting machines where with touch screens and stuff. And they were using a system where you took a ballot and you like punched at it with a pen, and you drove a hole, like you poked a hole in the thing next to the name you wanted. They had this horribly confusing ballot that was just nonsensical. And there were like, in Florida, there were like 12 third parties got their name on the ballot. So it's just names everywhere. And they're like staggered to where there's like, a hole here and then a hole here, and they're not like straight in a line. I mean, it was so confusing. Causes a bunch of people to vote accidentally for Pat Buchanan when they meant to vote for Al Gore. Pat Buchanan being another third party candidate. You had, it was so much stuff going on. So then the whole election turns in, and so Gore people had a grievance with the confusing ballot that led to Pat Buchanan, who had some accusations of anti-Semitism, doing shockingly really well in one of the most Jewish counties in the country, because his name was right next to Al Gore. And then the Bush people had the complaint that a lot of their people didn't go to the polls because they thought they'd already lost Florida. And then on top of that, the final race comes down to just a few hundred votes, which in the whole span of how many people live in Florida, one of the biggest states in the country, that's not much at all. And so Florida goes by law, into an automatic recount. Well, adding to the controversy, Governor Bush's brother, Jeb Bush, is the governor of Florida. And so it is Jeb Bush appointees who have to certify the election, which adds a degree of drama to the whole thing. And obviously most Democrats would say, an air of impropriety, but that's the law. And what do you expect them to do? Say, I'm not going to allow my appointees to do their jobs, So, so there's all kinds of lawsuits. People are saying, some of them are suing, trying to get ballots cast out for having multiple votes. There were a lot of ballots that were contested because some people had like poked at one hole and then pushed through another one, or pushed through two holes. And if you vote twice, if you push through two holes, your vote doesn't count. If you cast two votes, your ballot's thrown out by law. So, and no one can mind read these things. And so obviously, it turns into, every lawyer in America descends on Florida. Every Republican lawyer, every Democratic lawyer, they go into, full steam ahead. And it takes us 5 weeks to find out who's going to become president. I can't remember the order in which it happened. I think it went down like this. I think I remember going to bed. I was like 13. I think I remember like going to bed at like 9 or 10. Excited that Bush had won. And then probably being woken up by my parents at midnight to say that, oh, no, actually Gore won, and going to bed sad, and then waking up in the morning and finding out that we actually don't know. Or it might have been vice versa. I can't remember. But I do remember being awoken to discover the election, that they had swapped. They had kind of called the race for both people. It turned into a fiasco. Finally, the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decision, Bush v. Gore. The Supreme Court does decide on a 5-4 party line vote, with 5 Republicans voting in favor of Bush, 4 Democrats voting in favor of Gore, to certify the Florida election results, which favored Bush. So Bush becomes president. Gore wins the popular vote by this much. Bush wins the electoral vote, which is one that matters, by that much. And so Bush comes into the White House. And because of the nature of the election, which, I'm a firm believer that Bush won fair and square, but at the same time, if you put yourself in the shoes of a Democrat, you can also see how you would be like ready for war. You stole this election with your 5-4 decision, right? So that's the mentality that they took into the Bush years. So you do have some pretty strong partisan conflict through the Bush years, and I gotta say, I lived through the Bush years. In hindsight, Bush is going to have made a bunch of mistakes that we'll talk about as we go through here. In hindsight, I wish he'd done several things different. But at the same time, the people that were criticizing him at the time were so insane about how they did it, literally comparing him to Hitler at times. Just, I mean, the degree of stupidity makes the level of stupidity that was around, that happens around, Trump and stuff, just look like child's play in my view. So it just, I mean, the absolutely insane hatred of Bush was something I just never was able to get. But nonetheless, Bush, you know, passes some major legislation pretty early on. One of the big campaign issues had been what to do about the government's surplus, because they actually had more money than they needed, in contrast to most of the recent years where we've had, significant deficits. We actually had a surplus going into 2000, and so the question everyone was running on, what do we want to do? Bush was saying we should, cut taxes and turn this into tax cuts. Gore was saying we should spend that on this program or that program. Bush goes tax cut route and, passes a pretty substantial tax cut. He also passes on a bipartisan basis what turns out to be now a bipartisan hated bill, the No Child Left Behind Act, which nationalized certain educational standards, and a lot of people, teachers love to complain about it. You had some other signature things I'm trying to think. He actually did expand Medicare to include a prescription drug benefit, which was more popular with the left than with the right. But nonetheless, the liberals still hated on him because of the tax cut stuff. But Bush's presidency, which was, which he thought was going to be very much a domestic policy-oriented presidency. The world had been at relative peace. The Soviet Union was gone. Winds up taking a dramatic turn September 11, 2001. Y'all probably know the gist of it, of course, but on this day, Osama bin Laden, who had already become infamous for the bombings of American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, perpetrated by his group Al-Qaeda. I should say Al-Qaeda followed up before 9/11. There was another terror attack by them in 2000 where they rammed a suicide bomber into an American naval vessel called the USS Cole that was anchored off of the coast of Yemen, a Middle Eastern country. So they were already notorious for the USS Cole thing and for the embassy bombings. September 11th, 2001, a group of terrorists associated with the radical group Al-Qaeda hijacks 4 commercial airliners in the United States, flies 2 of them into the World Trade Center, which at the time was the signature of the New York skyline. When you thought of the New York skyline, the first thing you thought of was the 2 towers of the World Trade Center, the so-called Twin Towers. And then a third one flies into the Pentagon, right into the heart of the American defense mechanism. And then a fourth plane was actually taken down by the passengers aboard the plane in a heroic action where they kind of sacrificed their lives to prevent it from being used as a weapon, because by then the news had kind of leaked to them through phone calls and so forth. We don't know for sure where that was going. We think that plane was either headed for the White House or the Capitol building. But it was brought down in a field in Pennsylvania. I was in 9th grade when this happens, and I will tell you, it was quite the day. I remember the first class of the day, the first plane had just hit, and I remember. We even kind of were laughing about it, like, how bad of a pilot do you have to be? It hadn't become obvious to us that it was terrorism yet. I would go into second block, we're in the computer lab, and all of a sudden, this one teacher burst in, and he's like, everyone get into the 5th and 6th grade room right now. So we go down to that room had a TV, and all of a sudden, I see there's a split screen, and on one half of it, you've got the World Trade Center, but with one of the towers gone and the other one smoldering, and then you've got the Pentagon on fire. And there was this one kid who was kind of a class clown, said, quote, I have mixed feelings about the Pentagon. And then his brother told him to shut up. This is my first memory of 9/11. And of course, I was in Virginia, so I'm like 3 hours from D.C. So this is a little, and the Pentagon is technically in Virginia, so this is a little more concerning, to us than it probably even would have been to a lot of people, because they're like, if they're going to do something against the Capitol, like, that's not far from here. Even though I was, in more of a small town setting, but it wasn't very far away from me. So, I remember that was a crazy day, and I actually was watching we were watching TV as a class when the second tower comes crumbling down, and of course, ultimately I think the death toll of the whole thing winds up being over 4,000 people that died on 9/11. I don't think I can really get across the degree of shock that this brought to America at the time. There was a very brief period that was probably the most bipartisan moment in American politics in the 21st century. It lasted about 6 months in the aftermath, and then it degenerated in the opposite direction. There was, you couldn't go anywhere without people having American flags on. Everything that they could possibly put an American flag on. But there was like a real sense of like kind of the world being shocked back into realizing, that whole idea that we talked about in the 90s that some people had of that history had kind of reached its end and that democracy was inevitably the way of the future and everything. 9/11 is kind of a shock to the system that says maybe it's not. We wind up moving into a position of enmity with radical Islam that becomes analogous in some ways to our opposition to communism during the Cold War era. I read the vast majority of George W. Bush's autobiography, Decision Points, which is a very good book if you ever get the chance to read it. And in it, he kind of explains his thought process on... he walks through what happens on 9/11, and it was even wilder than you would expect. President Bush, when it happens, was actually reading to a bunch of school children. Perhaps you might have seen the videos somewhere at some, photo op trying to push his new education bill. And some Secret Service guy kind of walks up to him and whispers in his ear, "So there's been an attack on the World Trade Center. One of the towers is down." And Bush, you see this look of resolve kind of come over. I tell you what, he may have made some mistakes in the aftermath that we'll talk about, but there was nobody alive who would have been less rattled by the moment, I believe. But Bush winds up, actually finishes the story so as to not project, fear into the children, and then gets on the plane. When they get on Air Force One, according to his autobiography, they were having trouble with the signal, and there was all this bad intelligence coming in that they didn't know how to sort out, where they actually at one point had thought there had been more attacks than there were. So we knew that 4 planes had been hijacked. They were under the impression that it might have been more. And there might have even been other strikes because there's all this fog of war. They said they were having really kind of bad reception. They were even having a hard time getting cable news up in the air because they put them in the air immediately to try to get them away from kind of any reasonable place he could be targeted. They finally got him into Washington. They put him in an underground bunker that night. He actually, in a kind of defiantly resist sleeping in the bunker and goes to bed in his regular bed, and then the Secret Service get a false alarm and in the middle of the night and wake him up, and then he goes down to really more for their sake to hear him tell it. And so Bush, from there, he says in the book that the single most difficult decision he ever had to make as president was the decision of whether or not he should, to issue a fire order on other planes that are in the air, because by then the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, which handles all the air traffic, and you can't take off in a plane without the approval of the FAA. They made a rule nationwide to shut down all air travel. The airplanes didn't open back up there was no air travel in America for several weeks. And so with that, and then once it came back, there was a level of security in airplanes now that was very foreign to people's mentality at the time. And this whole thing of everyone having to get frisked on the way into the airplane, all this kind of stuff that didn't happen before this. So so Bush has to decide what happens if there's a plane that's still in the air. And the decision he ultimately has to make is that if a plane is still in the air, they get one chance to respond if they're radioed to identify themselves. And if they're friendly, they've got one chance to identify themselves. And if they can't do it, that they need to be fired on. And of course, that created a situation where a simple radio miscue could have led to, an Air Force jet firing a rocket at a commercial airliner and, killing 150 civilians. But that was ultimately what he decided was the safer thing to do. He said that was the hardest decision he ever had to make in his whole presidency. And thinking about the consequences of that really makes it obvious why not everyone should want to be president, and why I would not want to be president, I don't believe, because of just the gravity of having to make a decision like that. It was really kind of hard to fathom. So 9/11 kind of puts America on a war footing. The only question is right away. We don't know who it is right away on day one, but it doesn't take long. Within a couple of days, Al-Qaeda winds up claiming responsibility. And Al-Qaeda was a multinational organization, involved Muslims from across the world, predominantly from the Middle East. Many of the hijackers were Saudi Arabian or Egyptian. Which Saudi Arabia and Egypt were both governments that the U.S. is friendly with at the time. So that created some awkward diplomatic situations. But Bin Laden himself was Saudi, and as I think we mentioned this when we talked about the 80s, he had gone to Afghanistan to fight in the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. From there, he built Al-Qaeda out of this group of people that had fought with him in the Soviet-Afghan War. And the nation of Afghanistan had, turbulent history. So the communist regime falls. Ultimately, the communists lose that war, and Afghanistan was taken over by a group known as the Taliban. And the Taliban were the most radically, backward, fundamentalist, oppressive Islamic regime in the world, perhaps even worse than the Iranians. Girls literally could not get an education at all. They didn't believe in giving girls schooling at all. Whereas in Iran they made all the women wear veils, to cover their face. In Saudi Arabia, they made them all wear veils that covered everything except their eyes. So if a woman is by some chance in public, you literally could only see her eyes. So horribly repressive regime. But the leadership of Afghanistan, of course, felt indebted to bin Laden in their help. And they allowed Al-Qaeda to have free use of the country with no legal repercussions, and in fact some government encouragement of their terrorist ways. They were still in the midst of a civil war with a faction known as the Northern Alliance. And so the Northern Alliance was a group that had still not agreed to submit to the rule of the Taliban. But the Taliban had functional control of the country. So the United States goes to the Taliban and says, we want Osama bin Laden, hand him over or else. And they say, no, sir, we won't. lying infidel American dog. We're not going to hand him over. And so we say, okay, or else it is. And so begins the American adventure in Afghanistan, which as of present is still going on. Started in the fall of 2001. There are still troops there today, although they are kind of on their way out. We just signed a peace treaty with the Taliban just a couple months ago, like this calendar year, like January or February of this year. And I'm not sure all the terms, if there's something that might trigger us going back in, or like what the deal is. But so Afghanistan becomes the longest war in American history, breaking the record that had been held by Vietnam. You literally, the vast majority of you, we've talked about this, literally have never been alive when America was not at war in Afghanistan. Now, unless you had military family, you didn't really recognize it because it didn't become the kind of total war that World War II became, where, everyone was having to go plant Liberty Gardens and buy war bonds and, all this stuff. But, if you didn't actually have loved ones fighting overseas, or if you didn't fight overseas yourself, it was just kind of something in the news that you could kind of ignore or not. Which is a very different phenomenon than a lot of American history was like. But war in Afghanistan, war in the Middle East has kind of been just the way of the world for the last, nearly 20 years now. And so the mission that we set up was this. Our goal was to, here's what happened. So Bush comes out and he basically makes a speech. He says, we're declaring, and he used this language, we are declaring war on terror. Now, this is not a formal declaration of war, although the Congress did kind of back this up with some legislation. He says, we're declaring war on terror. And that means that even though Al-Qaeda was the group that was initially responsible, he also was serving notice to any other radical groups that will want to be involved in an action like this. They might want to do copycat operations, whether it would be Hezbollah, which is backed by Iran, or whether it might be Islamic Jihad or the Muslim Brotherhood or any of these Hamas, which is Palestinian, any of these groups, basically said, if you're standing for the use of terror to establish, this kind of politicized Islamic theocracy, you are the bad guy. Now, one thing that Bush did almost to a fault to me was he did kind of push this whole thing of, he was really careful. He didn't want to hurt our relationships with peaceful Muslim governments and so on. So he really kind of pushed this whole thing of, don't blame Islam, it's religion of peace and so on. And I understand what he's trying to do, because you don't want people like committing hate crimes or like blaming them for 9/11 happening when they were just going about their business, But at the same time, like it's not a coincidence, in my view, that there's conflict in every Muslim society in the world, So, I think that has something to do with the way that, with passages in the Quran. But anyway, there's some controversy, that comes from Bush kind of trying to push that line so much that I didn't entirely like. But he basically says, if you're standing with terror, if you're standing with this use of terrorism for these goals, we are setting ourselves against you, whether you were directly responsible for 9/11 or not. Well, actually, before I go any further into the response, I should say, so why did bin Laden do what he did? Like, why did 9/11 happen? There's a few reasons. So first, bin Laden was committed to the idea of restoring the caliphate, which was the Islamic government of the Middle East that had existed in the medieval era. So he wanted to restore the caliphate and bring Islamic theocracy along the lines of what existed in Iran and Afghanistan to the world. So he wanted to bring down democracy, just as he wanted to bring down communism. He didn't care for any of these different Western ideas. He wanted Islam to be the dominant force in the world, and for the world to follow what they called Sharia law, which was the term for the government by the Islamic rule of law. He particularly resented America because he believed that America, as kind of the leader of the Western world and as one of the dominant cultural forces in the world, had spread a lot of ideas that he considered to be sinful, from his Islamic perspective. He looked at Americans as being, rich and immoral and loose living and not following the ways of the Quran and so forth. So he really, they really wanted to strike a blow at America. They didn't necessarily think that they were going to blow up the Pentagon and lo and behold, America would be done with. But they wanted to make a big dramatic gesture that would make a statement and that would potentially lead us into a place of terror. They wanted people to be to be afraid, and to a certain extent, they succeeded for a certain period of time. And so he starts. So Bush's response is he declares this war on terror, and he says basically you're either for us or you're against us. And so because Afghanistan had refused to hand over bin Laden, we decided to make war on Afghanistan. And so we had a couple objectives. The first thing is we wanted the Taliban gone because they had set themselves on the wrong, we drew a line, they put themselves on the wrong side of it, so we want them out of power. We want to capture bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, who directly did it after we've gotten rid of the Taliban for helping facilitate it. And then, and this is where it gets controversial and where we maybe got a little too big for our britches, the third thing was we wanted to install a democratic system of government in Afghanistan and in the Middle East, because we started to believe, a lot of people in Bush's whole foreign policy advisory group was very hawkish. They believed in the power of the military. They believed in projecting American might and American strength. Sometimes, in hindsight, they maybe were a little overconfident about our ability to transplant some of our ideals into foreign cultures. Because if you look at how American democracy developed, it was through hundreds of years of development in the British common law, followed by 150 years of, colonial governments developing independently from each other and then gathering around a common independence movement in 1776. And then common cultural changes, expanding democracy, first to the poor, and then to, and then to minorities, and then to women. So there was this very organic growth of democracy that happened over several hundred years. Afghanistan's never been a democracy. Iraq, which looks like at this time of day, it looks like we'll have to save that for tomorrow and finish up with the Iraq War. Iraq had never been a democracy. And so one of the mistakes that Bush kind of made in hindsight is feeling like we could just install democracy in some of these Middle Eastern countries that have, these deep kind of tribal and Islamic type thought process, and just thinking it would take root in quite the same way. And that's not to say that I think it's impossible for Middle Eastern democracy to develop, but I think it has to happen a little more organically than we wanted to just kind of make it happen from the top down. I just don't know if that's as feasible as we thought it would be. So the goal of getting Afghanistan out of power, or getting the Taliban out of power in Afghanistan, happens very quickly. It's just within a few months that we, drive them out of the capital city of Kabul and establish a regime of our own. It doesn't take a terribly long period of time. Maybe it was a year. One thing you want to keep in mind, people confuse Iraq and Afghanistan sometimes. Afghanistan is not even in the Middle East proper. It's in Central Asia. It's not the desert. Iraq is desert. Iraq is a lot of sand. Afghanistan, it's mountainous. It's kind of similar to the terrain. I guess it's maybe a little like the Rockies, but on steroids. The Hindu Kush Mountains, very, very rugged, very high peaks. It actually gets very cold in Afghanistan. It's not like Iraq where it was hot all the time. It might have gotten hot in Afghanistan too, but it did get cold at times. And there's caves everywhere, all through the hills. A lot of the terrorists hold up in caves. And Afghanistan was one of the poorest countries in the world. So it's not like we're coming into a country that has a whole lot of infrastructure. There's certain parallels. The terrain is different because Vietnam was more of a jungle type situation or a rainforest type situation, and this is kind of, mountainous and all this kind of stuff. But it's some similarities in the both were really in backwater places. But the problem with Afghanistan, the terrain of Afghanistan, it's impossible for one government to hold the whole thing because there's all these caves, difficult escape routes, um, all this kind of stuff. The government has never been able to control Afghanistan entirely. So a foreign invasion force isn't going to be able to control it entirely. And so what happens is when the Taliban is deposed, the Taliban, backed by Al Qaeda as well, continue the war as guerrilla warfare. And as we saw in Vietnam, guerrilla warfare is kind of the Achilles heel of the American military. We've never really been very good at it. So the Taliban keep it going, and the same way that the Viet Cong could escape into the jungle or across the lines into Cambodia and places like that. Some similarities here to how they could hit and run and then attack and get hide in caves that they know the layout of the land better than we do and not be able to find them. And their neighbor was Pakistan, was under a military dictatorship of a guy by the name of Musharraf. Musharraf was supposedly on our side, but he was never an ally that we really got along with or trusted well. He was on our side so that we wouldn't overthrow him too, but at the same time, there was some evidence at times that he was maybe playing both sides a little bit, and a lot of times people would attack across the border into Pakistan, which we then didn't really have the authorization to invade because they were a country that was supposedly allied with us. And in fact, when we do finally catch Osama bin Laden, which is going to happen years later when Obama's president, we actually find him in Pakistan. So at some point in time, bin Laden does escape from Afghanistan into Pakistan, hides in a compound there. You would have expected the Pakistani government to find out about this and tip us off to it sooner, but that's not the way the game played out. And so bin Laden is basically missing for the better part of a decade. I think it was maybe 2010 when we finally got bin Laden. So 8-9 years, went before he was brought to justice for what happened. Although, we should say that, he certainly didn't live the good life during those 8 or 9 years. What's fascinating about Osama bin Laden, he was actually exorbitantly wealthy. His family was one of the wealthiest families in Saudi Arabia. They made a fortune in high-level construction, so much that they got the contract to remodel Mecca, which is the holy city of Islam. And so, he absolutely, if Osama bin Laden had wanted to, he could have lived this really rich, lavish lifestyle, party to live the good life. He was in the upper class of the Arab aristocracy. Had mullah, like millionaire. And instead, he chose to live his life fighting in caves, shooting at Americans and planning terrorist attacks. Just kind of interesting life choice that bin Laden made. And so the tearing down of the Taliban government was quick, but the catching bin Laden took a long time. The bringing the Taliban to where they'll quit fighting the guerrilla war, trying to come back, is an ongoing process to this day, with us having just signed a peace deal that will supposedly leave our regime in place. What we did accomplish was establishing a new Afghan regime led by a fellow by the name of Hamid Karzai. And it is a democracy on paper. It did allow, the Afghan government did allow for elections. It did allow women to start receiving an education. There were some human rights progress. I'd rather live in Afghanistan now, even with the war, than I would have in 2001, probably. But the Afghan government was trash. It was not really a fully functioning democracy. It was corrupt. People still kind of ran it like a backwoods kind of tribal government, just the expectation that you got to, grease somebody's palm to get anything done. Very corrupt government, often kind of backstabbing us. The Afghan government that we spent so much blood and treasure trying to prop up was, arguably not really worth the effort. So the problem is, if you want to say we should have got out of Afghanistan sooner, though, which I'm actually sympathetic to, and I think I probably would agree with that. The problem with that is you still run the risk if you get out of Afghanistan too soon, and the Taliban take back over. You once again have a free zone to from which terrorists. Whether it's Al Qaeda or ISIS is going to emerge later out of Iraq, which we'll talk about that tomorrow. You still create a scenario where there's like free reign for people to plan terrorist attacks. And for terrorists to take refuge, and you don't want that because then you create a platform for more 9/11s, and so it's a very difficult decision to decide when was too much in Afghanistan. Of course, the Taliban knew that all they had to do was wait us out. They learned from the Vietnam experience. At some point, America's going to lose patience and not want to keep fighting over here. And they also learned from the Soviet-Afghan War, where the Soviet Union did finally fold and take themselves out of the equation. So, all that being said, Afghanistan turns into a bit of a mess at times. And for much of the time in Afghanistan, our forces were also diverted fighting two wars at once, and we'll talk about how that goes down tomorrow. I should add one epilogue on catching bin Laden, since it doesn't look like we're going to get to a full treatment of the Obama-Trump years, which that's still kind of more current events anyway. But bin Laden is finally caught. Kind of the one good thing that Obama did as president. That's about the only one I can give him that I can think of. But he did make the decision to go ahead and send a special forces troop, a Delta Force unit, into Pakistan, even though we weren't at war with Pakistan. It was kind of, legally, it was the same kind of scenario that Nixon was in Cambodia, where it's militarily the right thing to do, but it was very politically risky because it was, technically illegal. That's basically what we did, but I actually support the decision in this case. But, the killing of bin Laden nearly turns into a disaster because the helicopters actually crash land. We send in two choppers. One of them has a rough landing, nearly blows our cover, nearly could have been a big disaster. But thankfully no one was killed to my knowledge. If it was, there was only one or two people. And, ultimately, bin Laden dies using a child as a human shield, if the accounts are to be believed. And one other thing, too, we talked, as we go back, before we talk to the Afghan War, I should say, too, that there was just, in the aftermath of 9/11, even before we knew that we were going to go to war with Afghanistan, general sense of unease and kind of fear in the American public. You had, not long after 9/11, you had a couple of folks who actually turned out to be Islamic radicals again, named John Allen Muhammad and John Lee Malvo, and who drove around the Washington, D.C. area and some of the suburbs of southern Maryland and northern Virginia with sniper rifles in a white van and just picking off random people who were like pumping gas at a gas station, and then would just like pop people. Just at random, wound up killing like 15, 16 people doing that. Right around the same time, you had some crank sent a series of envelopes to senators, congressmen, important people filled with anthrax, which is, a chemical warfare specimen. I mean, it's a dangerous substance that is poisonous and can kill you by contact. And so they had these letters filled with anthrax that were going out to through the mail to random congressmen and stuff like that. And all of this happened within a few months of 9/11. So it was really kind of a scary time for maybe a year or so, that a lot of people were really kind of afraid to, afraid to go out and live life regular. That wasn't necessarily, my family per se, but that was how a lot of people felt about things. So kind of some crazy times. And so this leads, though, this whole thing of we're never going to let something like this happen again. That idea was so huge to people. We will never let this happen again. And that is going to lead us, it obviously led us into the war with Afghanistan, but we'll see also how this is going to lead us to try to finally deal with the problem of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, which is another case where we maybe got a little more than we bargained for. And to that tale, we shall turn tomorrow. So y'all take care, and hopefully I'll get a chance to see you sometime fairly soon. It'll probably be the fall, I guess. But nonetheless, almost there. One more of these stupid things, and then you're free to go. So have a good time.